We're so pleased to welcome all of you back for what is now our 5th year of these symposia in which we partner and have partnered with National Louis University and Golden Apple. I looked up on Google, where else, what anniversary this would be for us. It's our wood anniversary, Dom. Yes, it would. And so it reflects, I think, this coming together of 3 different organizations, a real melding of strengths and all of us representing and focusing on different aspects of education, and yet coming together for these wonderful, wonderful thought feasts. And I'm very proud to be part of it. We're so proud to have MacArthur joining us as well in this specific symposium tonight. With that, I would love to introduce you to Dom Belmonte, who is both the president and CEO of the Golden Apple Foundation. Sir.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you for coming out on a very beautiful fall evening to have conversation with us. And great to have our partners, National Louis and Chicago Shakespeare, with us as well. In the pre-Apple Microsoft era, 1986, Paul Simon wrote, "These are the days of miracle and wonder. This is the long-distance call, the way the camera follows us in slow-mo. But in this town, the camera follows us to try to give us $100 fines, as you know." And while once upon a time we marveled at our grandparents having lived through color TV and jet travel, now we have taken over. We are now our grandparents who have now witnessed a change. All of us who remember music by way of 8-track music would remember that things are just different. Till I say, as I say to young people who are going to teach, I say, soon there'll be a time when our music will be embedded in our neck. And it'll just be a simple twist of the torso, changing stations as we are. And it's also given rise to things that make older people like me frightened. In a world where my generation was, the sticks and stones will break your bones generation. You want to say something to me? Okay, fine. Walk away. Yet today, in cyberspace, the worried parent thinks that there's going to be these people, these trolls, which you remember used to be the ones with the hair that we used to play with, but now they're far more evil and far more intense, so we think, saying to our young people, "You're fat, you're ugly, you kill yourself," and people finding rope and finding sturdy beams in there, and that's, of course, the fear that we have. The report that was done in the New York Times, in an article that's called "Dealing with Cruelty in the Digital World," said that there were, according to the Pew Institute, 70% of media users said they have seen people being cruel to others on social network sites. The same Pew Institute also says in this article that 70% people have seen instances of grace and the kindness to people. So if Pew can add 70% and 70%, I guess we can have the conversation. And certainly our guest here, Dana Boyd, will tell us, especially me, a Luddite parent, that don't worry, it's all fine. The kids are all right. And my colleague, Sam Dyson, a proud part of Golden Apple family, will also help frame the context of this conversation about this brave new world of ours and our children who have entered into it. Helping us and moderate us is a spectacular woman who I'm so proud to say continues with our work. I thought about her yesterday when I was driving around and saw a bumper sticker that made me think of her, and I chuckled. She has for years been a mainstay at WBEZ, but now, as you know, she has a new gig at Chicago Humanities. Oh, and that bumper sticker, it was, "Never underestimate the power of a redhead." And so I'm proud to give the rest of the evening over to the mighty Allison Cuddy.
Thank you, Dom. Every year, I'm very honored to be here. I'm very excited to be here to have these conversations, and I'm always a little challenged because I've got to follow that guy. And how do you follow Dom? But thank you so much for that great introduction. And yes, I think that is one of the themes of this evening. The kids are all right. The other theme is that we just kicked off Social Media Week here in Chicago. And so, yes, please, give it a round of applause. Social Media Week does not get enough love, in my estimation, but it's a big week for us. And so in honor of that, we're trying to incorporate social media not only into the content and the thinking of tonight, but also into your participation. So if you want to engage in the conversation via Twitter, the hashtag is SMW, Social Media Week, Teens. So SMW Teens is the hashtag. If you follow that now on Twitter, you'll see there's already a pretty lively conversation and lots of energy going on there. So, and if you're trying to get onto the network in here, I understand that the password is William800, which may come as a surprise to you. William? William who? So, I am going to get things underway right away. We'll follow the usual format. We'll have about 50 minutes of conversation, and then we'll take your questions and comments. We would like you to keep those questions as precise and to the point as possible. How many people here have watched Jeopardy? You know, when they have to come up with the answer and you start hearing that da 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 da. So that will be going off in my head when you're asking your question or making your comment. And if I get through 2 rounds of it and you haven't finished, I'm going to be the human buzzer and ask you to get to the point. Not because you're not brilliant and saying something great, but because there are so many people here that we want to have participate tonight, and because we're bringing questions in via social media, that I'm just going to try and keep you moving along. So please don't take it personally, but I will try and keep us moving tonight. We'll have about 20 minutes of questions, and if you don't get to ask your question, fear not. We're going to have a lovely reception outside with food and beverages, and you'll have the opportunity to talk with everybody here. So we encourage you to stick around after. But first, let's get the conversation underway, and I want to invite to the stage Sam Dyson, who is the director of the Hive Chicago Learning Network, which is a MacArthur-funded initiative, but is operated by Mozilla. Where's the love? I thought we were... There we go. We rehearsed this.
Sorry.
This,
I didn't want to interrupt you. I'm sorry.
You did a very good job. So Sam has developed all kinds of connected learning programs and resources for teens and adults, including high fashion here in Chicago and New York. He's done STEAM Studio, which is a pop-up maker space at the Chicago Cultural Center, and maker party events like Destination Chicago, connected with the Chicago City of Learning. I'm sure many of you here are familiar with that. And his prior educational experience includes educational administration in both community-based and Chicago public school contexts, and 10 years of physics teaching experience. Wow. That's fantastic. I have a lot of questions for you afterward. He is also fittingly a 2007 recipient of the Golden Apple Award for Excellence in Teaching. So please welcome Sam Dyson. So as I've been preparing for this event, a kind of buzz has been developing around the event, the conversation, but particularly around the name Dana Boyd. I can't believe how many educators are excited to hear her talk. Her resume is incredible. One of the things you might know best about her is she is the author of It's Complicated, The Social Lives of Network Teens. She's also the founder and president of a new think-do tank called the Data and Society Research Initiative, which examines the intersection of technology and society. And she's a principal researcher at Microsoft Research, a research assistant professor in media, culture, and communications at New York University, and a fellow at Harvard's Berkman Center for Internet and Society. So please welcome Dana Boyd. So I guess it's always good to start at the beginning, and maybe we could start by having both of you tell us not how we got here, but how you got here. What got you interested in thinking about young people and social media?
So for me, I was actually a teenager who grew up online. I was one of the rarefied folks way back in the day when it involved dial-up and very expensive phone bills that my mother still hasn't forgiven me for. And I saw the internet as a saving grace. I was born and raised in rural Pennsylvania. I didn't feel like I belonged. And the internet in those days was a space for self-identified geeks, freaks, and queers, for which I was all three, so it was right at home. And I was in love with it. I went and I decided I was going to build these systems because that would be fabulous. And I studied computer science, and I got really enamored with it. But I kept finding that I was just curious about what people were doing, how they were negotiating these systems. And I ended up studying a lot of social network sites originally, the early days, back in those days of Friendster, for those who might remember it. And I ended up following the social network sites and all of this. But I kept having this little voice in the back of my head wondering what had happened now that these technologies had gone mainstream. And so I had the great opportunity of working with folks at the MacArthur Foundation to really take a step back from my social network research and dive in and ask questions about what were young people were doing with technology. The original goal, by the way, was Instant Messenger and Zanga and LiveJournal. It was back in those days of all of it. And then, of course, I had the beautiful moment of watching my two worlds collide around MySpace. And I got to see the rise and fall of MySpace and the rise, and we can argue, fall of Facebook. But it was a really great moment of being able to watch not just from a technical lens, but actually from all the social lens. And so I spent a lot of time driving around this fair country of ours, talking to young people in 16 different US states, and trying to learn how they were using things, and being a participant myself. I mean, I built these systems, I knew how they worked, and so it was really fun to watch that all connect.
Sam, what about you?
My point of entry to this conversation actually happened when I was a physics teacher at Peyton, and I really liked teaching physics because it was the kind of thing that was really hard to do by telling. So I had to design experiences and facilitate those. And I had designed one experience that was engaging the students in thinking about motion, force and motion, and momentum. And like good physics teachers do, I asked them for their expectations of what was going to happen in this experience. And they did some thinking and sort of arguing about that. And then we did the experiment. It was just two cards colliding. And one young woman in the class said something that continues to echo in my head, which is, after seeing these cards collide and do something she didn't expect, she said, "I don't believe it." Like, I just saw it, but the context I have for understanding why that would happen is so disconnected from what I just saw that I completely reject it. Now let's move on. And most people, when confronted with an experience that doesn't match what they expect, do reject it. And she was just brilliant for being self-aware about it. And my epiphany at that moment was that teaching was about changing not what people think, but changing what people believe in a deep sense. Mm-hmm. And that forced me to understand the contexts that make experiences meaningful. In a physics context, we could go to Great America to ride a roller coaster to have an experience that would help make that classroom experience relevant. What are the other contexts outside of physics where kids can go that make learning relevant, that make it meaningful? And I think that's the thing that invites me into this conversation about digital media, because of the discovery that, in fact, they're using this as one of the many spaces in their lives to make meaning and to learn. And our job, the job that I've undertaken, is to try to help ensure that those otherwise separate worlds of learning actually connect.
You know, that is fascinating because you sort of put your finger on something. When we think about young people, teenagers, and digital learning or digital media, right? We look to young people as sort of the promise and potential of this new technology, and that they're plugged into it in a way, those of us who aren't quote unquote digital natives, are. But we also have a lot of anxiety around young people and social media and what is going on there, what is meaningful about what their experiences are, and why does it make me so anxious to think about my teenagers being in this space? So can you start talking a little bit about that, Dana? I mean, because you definitely come from the kind of point of view that embraces young people's experiences in this space.
You know, we're both afraid of and afraid for young people. We're afraid of all the things that they might do that get themselves into trouble, and we're afraid for them in all the things that might actually harm them in different ways. And this is not new. This has been true way back. Each new technology, we get a different point of anxiety. It comes and it becomes part of our story in different ways. What makes social media different is that a lot of where our fears come from are the things that we can see that we previously didn't see, right? Any adult in this room knows that there are things you did that you're really glad that no one else saw, right? They were embarrassing, they were stupid, like, oh yeah, it was a great idea to jump over that cliff, right? Really good idea with your friends. But part of what makes it tricky in an mediated world is that we live our mistakes out in different forms of public. And we have to account for that. And now, where we got there, the reason we got there is that we've actually spent the last 30 years restricting young people's access to public spaces because we're afraid of them and afraid for them. And so they've found a lot of ways in finding technology to be a relief valve. And they do all of the good, bad, and ugly things that you could ever imagine. But I get worried because we look at the technology, we blame the technology rather than thinking through what they're doing, the risks that they're taking, and how it's valuable. And this is, where I think Sam and I connect in interesting ways because, a lot of these moments of experimenting, making a mess out of things, doing dumb things, saying stupid things, are how you learn. It's how you figure out how the world works. It's how you figure out how to navigate the spaces around you. And we don't give young people credit for the unbelievable amount of time and energy that it takes to learn how to navigate the world. And it's not just young people, by the way. We adults suck at it too, right? And we're constantly having to learn and relearn, and boy, do we make mistakes on social media, right? And so part of it is realizing that this learning process is a process of navigating these different environments over and over again. And that's part of the beauty of anything that allows us to connect to other people, to information, to ideas, to hobbies, to anything about this world that we live in.
One of the things that struck me about some of the things you wrote point to the fact that technology actually isn't the transformative agent. It's the human interaction that is the transformative agent, and it's the thing that young people are so often looking for. I also appreciated the extent to which you point out that although we often think of young people as digital natives who have a capacity for navigating the connections that they find through digital media, that many are actually not able, they're not born with a natural capacity to know how to do that. Yeah. And I think one of the things educators have the ability to do is figure out how to respond to the opportunity provided by the presence of young people engaged in not just social interaction for social interaction's sake, but often social interaction for getting better at something that they care deeply about.
So a social interaction that can feed into kind of a more narrowly defined educational goal or objective?
I'm curious about your choice of more narrowly defined.
Well, I don't mean narrow in the sense, because I guess, so Dana, for you, you're looking broadly at social interactions, what youth do online and the different ways they socialize, and this is a space for potential. But I guess I was thinking, so there's that whole realm, and then there's the realm of education, and they're not entirely separate, obviously. And the two of you here tonight talk about, or express the ways they're connected. But I think what I heard you saying was that some of that kind of sociability that Dana is looking at, there are lessons or there are things that you can draw from that feed into sort of a more narrow set of objectives within a course or a classroom or a curriculum.
I think one of the things I take away from the research that that MacArthur has done a lot to advance around digital media and learning is that when young people are online, they're doing a lot of things. But at a fundamental level, they're hanging out, they're messing around, and they're geeking out. Meaning that some of it is social, some of it is exploring. When I say messing around, I don't mean in a it's purely social sense. I mean trying things out, tinkering with things, and they're going deep on things that they discover and want to get better at, whether that is spoken word poetry or media making or what it might be. And so I think one of the things that's emerged from that research is the realization that kids are already learning in those ways. There are ways to actually create physical spaces and face-to-face opportunities that mirror that kind of engagement. I think probably the best reflection of that in Chicago is the U-Media teen collaboration space at the Harold Washington Library, which is 5,000 square foot space that on the ground floor that's open only to teens, has lending privileges in it, and actually has more circulation in it than other places in the library for teens. So they're actually going and not just socializing, but using the resources of the library and also engaging in lots of messing around, whether that's through various forms of digital media. And when you create a space like that, it creates the context where caring adults, mentors, teaching artists, and so on, can recognize that there's a spark there, there's a desire to keep growing, and that spark can be fueled and sustained and supported in ways, and this is to your point about narrow, in ways that actually diverge across lots of interests.
I think this is the question also of where adults fit into this picture, right? What Sam is pointing out is what it means to create the spaces or the environments where young people can explore. And that's indeed extraordinarily important. But one of the reasons why the digital natives rhetoric is so devastating and dangerous is it assumes that skills just come down from above, right? You're born at a certain age and you are just going to be in the know. And indeed, that pathway of really experimenting, of hanging out, messing around, and geeking out, you get there to a certain degree on your own. But a lot of it has to do with whether or not you've got the conditions to be able to engage there, right? What level of privilege do you have? What kind of exposure to technology? How much free time do you have? How much opportunity do you have to play around? And how much of a guiding, post are the adults in your world? And this is where there's a scholar here in Chicago who focuses on the fact that this is a skills-based divide, and her name's Esther Hargitay, and she talks a lot about digital natives versus digital naives as an interesting tension. But there's another set of literature that offers us another way of thinking about it, and this comes out of some of the folks at Cornell, where they started to realize that when we set up the motion of digital natives, what we then say is that adults don't need to be responsible for kids' learning, right? They don't need to play a role in it at all. It'll just happen, right? And actually, I think that adults play a really critical role in it, not just in this aspect of setting things up or guiding, but also asking the hard questions, helping shape the conversation. And this is where I think that our lack of media literacy becomes extraordinarily devastating in this country. Right? We don't have a long history of it. We don't invite young people to be critical of the spaces around them. We don't invite adults to be critical of the spaces around them. Note, see politics. And it becomes this interesting challenge of how do we start to engage people critically of the environment around them. These technologies aren't perfect, right? You get on board, you're all great, all things are fine. No, but a lot of it is about being able to critically engage and explore them. And this is a lot of what Sam's work in the Hive Network does pretty phenomenal, is try to create these environments where young people can critically engage. But I also invite all of you, if you have kids, if you've got friends that are using these things, how do you invite your entire community to be critically engaged? This doesn't just have to happen in special environments. This has to happen holistically within our communities.
Well, so that's one area that you complicate. Like, what does it mean when we talk about digital natives, and how do we assess young people and their kind of the skills that they have within this space? So in a sense, sort of going deeper into that. The other thing that you are really interested in talking about is the ways in which, out of our anxieties, out of our own perceptions about what social media is and how we engage there, is how to regulate or not young people online. And I wanted you to talk about that because it seems like your point of view is you want adults to be engaged and be critical, but you also feel like we shouldn't hold young people back in this space. We should not monitor them or contain their activities, which I think for a lot of people, that's counterintuitive. I mean, there's an impulse to try and control that space and what young people do in it.
So a lot of this comes down to how we manage power, right? Which is to say that when you're a parent, you hold power over kids. When you're an educator, you hold power over kids. How do you go from a state where you are protecting and serving and supporting them to a space where they are independent and capable of making their own decisions? That transition is extraordinarily critical. And with my professor hat on, I'm very annoyed when the 18-year-olds show up in my classroom and have had no freedom and no experience and exposure. And it is not pretty, and it's a waste of your $40,000, right? This is not a good idea. Those teenage years are about making that transition, right? And it's about letting go slowly, allowing to explore freedom, and being there as a safety net, right? And this is why it's like my advocacy around this is not a ignore the kids, let them go off and be independent and figure out their own way. It's more provide the structures that they can experiment and explore and get a safety net around them. So if you're a parent of a child who's younger, it's about building out a network of other adults in their lives, right? Non-custodial adults. Because reality check, your kids don't always want to talk to you about everything, right? That's never going to happen. So the more adults that you build out in their world that they can turn to, the better off they are, which also means that they're going to friend that other cool, aunt or uncle on Instagram and not you, right? And that's okay. So part of it is really figuring out how to create that environment. The other thing is how to have a healthy communication line, right? Realizing it's going to be rocky, realizing your kids aren't always going to talk to you about everything. How do you figure out how to navigate this? And sometimes a lot of it is by learning how to ask questions. We in the United States ask really judgmental questions, right? It's just like, so why'd you do that, right? Oh, clearly that was wrong, whatever that was, right? You're not supposed to do that. And even these questions that we ask that are so leading, where your only answer is fine. So how was your day? Fine, right? That's terrible. I really love, there's an anthropologist named Jean Briggs, and she wrote this beautiful book called Inuit Morality Play. And it was how Inuit kids learn morality. This does not fly in America, note, note, note. Because what she would do is, or what the Inuit culture would do would be ask hard questions of their kids when they were really young. So imagine your child comes up to you and is like, Mommy, 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 I hate Bobby, he's mean, right? Rather than responding in an American way, it's okay, I love you. Really? What's that do? Instead, the question would be, well, why don't you kill him? Right? And you can just imagine how well, so do not do this in the playground, that will not go over, you will not make friends. But the reality is that your son would look at you and be like, well, I don't hate him that much. Well, how much do you hate him? Right? And just asking these questions. And that process of learning how to ask questions that get young people to think through their decisions can be absolutely phenomenal. I'll say this from my personal experience. I went through my rebellion stage. Oh, it was fun. And one of my favorite things was, of course, the moment I went to college, I shaved my head and I came home with pink buzzed hair. And my mother flipped out in the exact way I imagined her to do. And I was like, all right, I've rebelled. My grandmother looks at me and goes, why do you want to look like you were in the Holocaust? And walks off. Nothing made me think more about my self-presentation than that simple question, right? That is a terrifying question. She wasn't asking for an answer. She was asking a question to make me think. How do we get people in our world to think with the questions that we ask? That is such a powerful role that adults can play.
I want to talk more about the role of adults in this space, but I wondered if the two of you could kind of take us back and so sort of see some of the things that you see young people doing via social media, on Facebook, or formerly MySpace, via Instagram, whatever the technology is, that you're interested in, that makes you want to ask questions of them.
I think one thing they do that we all know they do is share a lot. Mm-hmm. This is interesting to me because it resonates with one of the kind of core values of the company or the organization that is the steward for Hive Chicago, the Mozilla Foundation. They employ the staff here, and we are Mozillians. And one of the things Mozillians believe in intimately is working in the open. And in fact, one of the core principles of connected learning is that the work should be openly networked. And I think the drive, check me here if I'm off, Dana, but I think the drive for sharing, both among youth and among adults working in a network context to create meaningful experiences for kids, the motivation is really the same. How can I invite people to help me do this thing I can't do on my own? So a lot of the sharing, though it may seem like just attention getting, a lot of the sharing is actually about building abilities that the community can help nurture and help extend. And I think that's one of the things that we want to be responsive to, is learning and working in the open, because it invites in the kind of input that pushes your work and even yourself and your identity to places you might not otherwise go.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I'm a researcher. Everything invites questions, right? We're bad at answering them, but we like to ask the questions a lot. I'm an activist. That's part of my identity. So nothing makes me sort of feel more excited than when I get to watch young people looking around at their world and wanting to make change. And I have unbelievable fascination. I spend a lot of time with, dreamers, using social media to try to challenge America's relationship to immigration policy, right? That's exciting to me. I have a lot of empathy for young people and geeks who don't particularly like how the social world is constructed, and so they challenge it in ways that are often problematic. And so, I spent a lot of time with self-identified betards. If you don't know what that means, don't look it up. This is 4chan, Wikipedia page only, please. But this is an amazing underground network of people who are just questioning the world that we live in and playing games with it. And it's all fun and games until you end up with an NSA situation and you have a lot of political activism around it. And you see those moments. Those are the things that, as a activist, I get really excited about. But part of it is, as a researcher, I also just want to understand what is every day. And I think that we don't give a lot of credit. We get so excited by the things that are rare, the things that are exceptional, the things that are pushing the edge or deeply problematic, but we don't take a moment to sit and recognize young people who are just going about their day, and they're trying to make their way in this world, and they're not the rock star A students, or they're not the big football players, or they're not the exceptionals, but they're in many ways the kids that are just part of this world. And how do we give them a way of participating in this world without always demanding that they always aim for being exceptional? Mm-hmm. And what does it mean to just help young people figure out how to be happy, right? And that's, in this culture, we're so obsessed with figuring out how to make them succeed, and boy, do we stress them out, that we don't really just recognize how important it is to find sort of inner groundedness and figure out your own place in this world. And teenage years are rough, right? Like, that's all about figuring out how you are. So that's why a lot of my research has been backing away from the extremes and just trying to look at what is typical.
So what is typical? I mean, Sam was talking about sharing, and I think that invokes a lot of anxiety for people. And it's not just young people, right? I mean, it's who, I think all of us in social media look at who shares what and makes value judgments about that. But we have a lot of anxiety overarching, and maybe we're thinking about the NSA, but if you're a teenager, maybe you're thinking more about what your mom or dad is reading over your shoulder. It invokes anxiety about privacy, and how do you kind of explore identity in this space without opening yourself up to something that may come back to bite you, whether it's encountering someone who may have bad intentions for you, or posting something that maybe doesn't look great on a job application or a college app.
I mean, young people want to be in public. That doesn't mean that they want to be public. They don't want everything to go down on their permanent record. None of us do, right? And so part of it is, how do you navigate this environment where you want to be in public? You want to get cred for the things that you do that are awesome. You want to get validation. You want to get support. You know, you made a really good track that you really want other people to listen to and really love, right? How do you get that going, and how do you share to create community, and how do you find the space that's really your own? And this is where young people do care about privacy. You know, anybody who's driving teenagers around, listening to them in the back seat, talking about all the things you can't understand, that's one of the ways in which they're getting privacy, right? Making certain that they've encoded everything so you have no clue. And
that's one of the practices online as well, right?
Absolutely. My favorite example of this is, which is just so geeky, which makes me very happy, this young woman that I met named Carmen in Massachusetts, and she loved that Facebook was the popular thing at the time, and she loved that her extended family from Argentina was all on Facebook. She loved that her friends were all there, and she was regularly code switching. She would speak in Spanish when she was really trying to talk to her family at large. She would speak in English, you know, when she was talking to her friends, and everybody got it except her mom, right, who tended to comment on both sides of this in ways that totally drove her crazy. And so, you know, one day she and her boyfriend have broken up, and she really wants to tell her friends from school what's going on, because she wants the love and the validation and the support, right? So she's trying to figure out how to tell them what's up. And so she's a teenager trying to express emotions, which means she's looking for the perfect song lyric, right? Because that's the way to express all emotions. And so she knows that if she puts something sappy and emotional, her mother thinks she's suicidal. It's happened before. It's a bit of a problem. So she's trying to figure out something that her friends will get and her mom won't. Now, her mom is Argentinian. She can rely on the fact that her mom does not know British cultural references and that her geeky friends just recently saw a movie. So she puts up the song lyrics from Always Look on the Bright Side of Life. Now, if you are not a Monty Python aficionado, this is a song sung in the life of Brian when the key character is being crucified. There is nothing happy about this scene, right? But the lyrics sound so lovely. Always look on the bright side of life. She posts this. Her mom immediately comments, "It looks like you're having a great day." And her friends text her, right? It's a beautiful game of encoding. And my favorite part about this story, mind you, is that I told this story, you know, like I mentioned, she was in Massachusetts. I told this story to the Boston Globe, and always using a different name for her. And sure enough, her mom read it in the paper and comes into our room and is like, "Look what kids are doing these days." And she was like, "Oh my God, really?" You know, so there's these funny moments in which we see young people just trying to make it work and just being like, "Adults, what's wrong with them?" Sorry.
I like that question. What is typical of teen engagement and behavior online? I think what's typical, as revealed in your book, Dana, is that seeking out context for connection is really typical. What is also typical is misunderstanding when those contexts are different and making the error of exhibiting a certain part of yourself in one context that spills over into another.
You call this collapsed context, right, Dana? Yeah, okay.
And this idea that context can collapse or converge for youth before they realize it, that the things they posted on Facebook get picked up and posted on another place where their privacy settings are different and are more visible to the world, can also often cause trouble. The idea of collapsing or converging of context, I think, is really poignant, really, because of the extent to which learning contexts rarely collapse. And I think that is what is typical, that young people do learn, and they are learning in these different contexts, but those contexts rarely talk to each other and rarely connect. Mm-hmm. And so, and when they do connect, it has the power of making the kind of relevant connections that lead to understanding that physics student in my classroom was searching for, that can spark the kind of awakening, really, that produces an irrepressible desire to keep growing And I think that is what we're trying to do, is to create more contexts, more opportunities for those otherwise separate contexts for learning to converge.
I want to flip it around for a moment and also just highlight how much learning goes into learning contexts, right? All of you are sitting here, you've been told you're in a lecture, you're actually sitting in your chairs pretending like you're paying attention. Right? That was a process that you learned, right? And I can guarantee you that this is not the state of being that you are always in, right? I expect that you go running around and you have fun and you cause adventures. I also expect that if a 2-year-old was in here, they would not be sitting on that chair so calmly, right? We learn contexts. We learn how to navigate them. And we learn how to deal with them when they get awkward, right? And when we don't learn that, we add alcohol, right? Which is really the solution to all of it. We don't have alcohol on the internet, right? No one's figured out how to invent that yet. So part of it is, how do we buffer those really weird moments where you're not sure if you're supposed to be sitting and nodding along or dancing on the table, right? 2 totally different kinds of actions. And yet somehow social media asks us to do all of this all at once. And not only all at once right now, but across all space and all time, right? That's really difficult. And so it's amazing to me how much thought goes into figuring this out. And this goes to Sam's point about, how do you learn these environments? How do you learn, and how do you find learning contexts? We don't appreciate how much learning goes on in all of the different contexts, but part of it is also to figure out how you socialize people into navigating these and to building their own contexts, right? The beauty of learning is that it doesn't have to happen in an environment like this. You learn in other places through other modes of interaction. How do we encourage more of those? How do we encourage people to create those? How do they use the tools that are around them to do this? And again, the solution is not alcohol.
It is fascinating. So none of this is new in a way. The way young people engage with one another, or the way they navigate social media, looks a lot like as you said earlier, Dana, the way they navigate different technology. Or the fact that we know that other contexts feed into the classroom, why family life is so important, extracurricular activities, that space for downtime, or just being with their peers, right? That all feeds into the kind of more formal learning. But it seems like some of the anxiety we have around this is precisely context and our inability to kind of contain that. You were talking about that earlier, Sam, and I think the sense that, however naively, that we can control what happens in the classroom, say, or in the family room, but we can't control what happens online. And so that something that gets some kind of conversation that starts online can kind of like explode and become viral, and you see these situations where people are, harassed or bullied, or, so can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that has a lot to do with the anxiety we have around teens and social media.
The short answer is it's really hard, right? Step out of teens for a moment. How do we control meanness and cruelty as adults, right? We have turned it into being our high entertainment. It is our reality TV. It is our news. It is our politics. It is what we accept as the way of interacting on a regular basis, is to be mean and cruel. And then we turn around and expect young people to figure out what we suck at. Like, how does that work, right? And part of what struck me when I watched young people trying to navigate a world of meanness and cruelty is that they're doing it in light of the templates we've set in motion, right? A way of understanding power and separation, a way of understanding status, a way of responding to stress. And it's partially because we do not provide the necessary relief valves. And think about it. Historically, we actually had young people, socialized across multiple age groups. These days, we age segregate, right? And so these dynamics of trying to figure out the world through a lot of physicality, through a lot of age differentiation, all get turned inward in peer environments. I say this because I think that, technology is the funny thing. It makes a lot of this more visible, but it's actually not increasing it. And this is one of the things that I found most shocking when I was doing a lot of this work. I assumed that the internet would be associated with the rise of a lot of bullying, for example. It's not. We have not seen rates of bullying rise in 30 years. That is usually very shocking to people. And so of course, it must be worse on the internet. Like, for young people, they must think it's far worse there than in school. Actually, no. Study after study shows that young people think that bullying is far worse at school, with greater emotional duress, with more significant consequences. Okay, well, but it extends, what's going on from school into the home life. It's a really important thing, and for some people, it really does. Actually, what young people continue to report back is that they get a lot of the support that goes beyond it. The place where I saw this most startlingly during my fieldwork was with question and answer services. I don't know how many of you remember FormSpring or Ask.fm. These kinds of things were anonymous services. And they were very strange because you asked somebody anonymously a question, and then they could respond. But the thing that really confused me as I was looking at them is that in order to make a response public, or in order to make a question public, somebody has to respond. So why is it that teenagers are responding to the most awful questions possible? That was really weird. So I took a look and I grabbed a bunch of the ones that were really insidious, and I went to the company at the time, which was FormSpring. I said, what gives? Why? What can you explain to me about this? And they came back to me and said, it's the same IP address that's asking the question as it is answering it in under 20 minutes. In other words, it's the same computer and most likely the same person that is asking an anonymous, cruel question, presumably of themselves, and responding to it. So another researcher, Elizabeth Englander, she decided to look into this and found that it was actually a much more common practice than any of us imagined. And when you dove in and you talked to these young people about what goes on, you heard two really common refrains. One, they wanted to look tough. They wanted to look confident. It was a really good way of looking like they could handle anything. And to that vein, when they looked like they could handle anything, nobody was cruel in response to them in other ways, because they were crueler to themselves than anybody would be around them. Whoa. Number two, they wanted to have eliciting tons of positive feedback from the people around them. Right? That is radically different than what we have seen. Right? What does it mean that young people have gotten to a point where they've seen cruelty so normalized that they self-inflict it as a way of getting validation from the people around them? That's part of why I sit and look at this, and we look at the technology. It makes this visible, and it's really important that we look. It is really important. But let's not get distracted by the technology, by the thing that's making it visible. Let's back up and figure out what's going on behind it, why, and what can we do about it. And a lot of it, honestly, is about starting by taking responsibility for us. And this is actually where we know that the biggest interventions around bullying are structures that usually take the form of things like social emotional learning. And schools implement these programs often half-heartedly because the thing that makes social emotional learning work is complete community involvement. And more often than not, parents and communities aren't willing to show up and account for their own meanness and cruelty, but yet expect it to be done for young people.
What do you hear from the students that you're working with, Sam, around this and like navigating that kind of cruelty, both like online and in these like learning environments that you're working with them in?
Well, I was going to ask you, Dana, if you could say a little bit about crisis text line, because it is a way in which technology and media are being used to provide young people an opportunity to voice, to call for help, to voice concerns.
Yeah, no. Sam's referring to, I'm on the board of an amazing organization called Crisis Text Line. And one of the things when we were looking at young people and their ability to reach out to support, we found that while there are many caring parents out there, most young people in crisis do not have adults that they can turn to. And so we've relied historically on hotlines as the way to do this. You know, the suicide hotlines, et cetera. Young people aren't calling, right? And they're not calling to ask for help for a whole variety of reasons, not the least of which is getting the privacy to actually make those calls these days. And the hours in which a lot of these hotlines work are really limited. And so Crisis Text Line was born out of this desire to allow young people to talk to a counselor via text message whenever they could. And that would conversations go over long periods of time. And you know, one of the things that's intriguing to me is as we started building this up, we realized that we could do a whole slew of other interventions. You could see a conversation as it twisted, as a young person needed to start out in one direction, get help in a different direction, and you could actually pull in different counselors who could help in different ways. And it was pretty phenomenal to see this. But the other thing that was shocking to us as we saw this, and Sam and I were talking about this before, was that young people, when they would make phone calls to hotlines, would try to feel out somebody, right? Who are you? Are you actually going to be able to help me? What we see in texting is a very different environment. last night my dad raped me, what do I do? Whoa, that is the way to begin a conversation, right? Like, oh. And you hear these really heart-wrenching environments and stories. I say this in part because one of the things that we're working on right now is coming to Chicago. Technically, anybody can text us anywhere from the country, but it's trying to figure out how to roll out and be part of this community. But it's an amazing, and this goes back to all of the phenomenal stuff that you're doing with Hive, is like, how do you take these moments where, in order for young people to really be as engaged and learning and happy and productive as we want, we need them to feel safe. Right? Safety is a first pillar, because if they're not safe, they're not going to be learning. If they're not actually able to get the support that they need, they're not able to do the amazing things that exist within the Hive network. And so I'm curious for you how you navigate that. How do you make certain that they have the structures to be able to take advantage of all the opportunities that you provide them through the amazing organizations you work with?
Yeah, the reason that came to mind, Crisis Text Line, is not only because it's an example of how modern media provide an opportunity for people to engage, to have community, to call for help in anonymous ways that can really be empowering, and that sort of safety that comes from that enables the engagement that we're trying to get to, but it also stands out because we're trying to create the context in the learning network for thinking about how a resource like that could not only be a place for youth to call for help or to be able to express their voice and be a tool for youth voice, but how it can also provide an opportunity for young people, kind of to your question, to not just be calling for help, but to be part of those giving the help. So in this particular instance, the people who are responding to the texts are sitting at a computer terminal, receiving these texts, and part of a community of adults and trained youth, trained adults and trained youth, to respond to these calls for help. And so part of what another key to unlocking engagement is agency. So if you put a young person in the position of responding to another in need, it grants them a certain agency that they might not otherwise have. And so, so in general, I think that the Hive Learning Network, with this as an example, is the emergent context for responding to what learning looks like in the digital age. And you can take a resource like this and throw it into the 57-member network and say, what could we do with this? And have people come back and sit down together and think about how that could be used as a resource in programming for teens throughout the city.
Yeah, agency is one of the key terms in your book, Dana, and something you both think deeply about. And it seems like, for all the reasons that you talked about previously, the way young people are kind of, their access to the real world public sphere is limited in many ways, that a lot of their communication is monitored or surveilled in different ways, and that this is one of the potentials of social media, a way to explore identity, develop agency, and autonomy, and sort of start testing those boundaries. What else is happening that you're seeing in terms of young people in this space, in terms of their emotional capacities or their cognitive capacities? I mean, even if you don't want to say that technology is like, the determining thing, what is this allowing? What are you seeing among young people?
I'll respond to it in a sort of funny, critical way. So historically, access to technology and communication was usually textual, right? And so one of the things about the cohort that grew up doing everything via, social network sites through text messaging was learning how to navigate a lot of social dynamics through text. And that actually was a phenomenal skill. And it meant that they were practicing that more often than verbal skills, right? Which is what panicked adults. But they became really sophisticated at it, right? In some ways that were also really endearing, right? I will never forget sitting with a 15-year-old boy who was trying to flirt with this girl, and it took him 45 minutes to craft the perfect 160-character text to look as casual as possible, right? It's
Again, not just a teen behavior, right?
And it's not that it's not that hard also to go back, and just think about all of the practice you had, trying to say the perfect thing to the girl that you thought was really hot in your head before you approached her, and then right? And so it's very funny to see that this text was a way in which that emerged. The reason why I point this out is because we're actually in this really interesting pivot moment right now. We are switching heavily to visual media, whether it is about images or whether it is about video. And we're getting really creative and thinking about how to express all sorts of things, right? So I joked with you about Carmen and the song lyric. It's just like, you think that Snapchat about a donut has anything to do with a donut? You're wrong, right? Like, it's totally about something you have no idea what's going on. That's part of the point. But what does it also mean to figure out how to express something, how to give emotion to a 6-second video? Right? How does that look? How does that feel? And I say this because young people are learning this. They're experimenting with it. They're figuring out how to deal with it. They're figuring out how to express themselves. And they don't necessarily need to be TV anchors to be trying to figure out how to do this, or movie directors. It's becoming a language of everydayness. And that's intriguing because we're going to see strengths and weaknesses of that form of expression. Right? It's not just that a picture is worth 1,000 words or whatever. It's the fact that this is a totally different way of trying to express things. And some young people are going to succeed at it much more comfortably than others. But I say this because I think that a lot of social media is really shaped by the practice that you have, right? So if you're practicing emoting through image, what does that look like as your way of self-expression? And this is where, you see all of the creativity side of it all, funneling into different kinds of more controlled or anchored ways. I see it all as sort of playful and fun, but these are both these phenomenal learning moments that I think we really want to acknowledge rather than just being like, oh my gosh, it's all pictures. What do we do with the pictures?
It's so interesting because that's something that there's such a fine line here, because it's a lot of this kind of experimentation and communication you're talking about among teens is something that we see as, it's like a phase you're going through, and it's something you leave behind as you become an adult. You don't see the value in how do you bring that forward into your kind of critical capacities as you develop. But it's also something that, definitely like corporations or advertisers really want to tap into and exploit, right, in order to sell things to young people.
It's also the way that a lot of activism is made possible in a totally different way today. It's not just about the marketing. I will never forget the great comment of Binders Full of Women. I'm sure many of you remember that. That was a great one. It took about, a minute and a half for the first macro images to get created of Binders Full of Women that then got sent all over the place, right? And all of a sudden you have young people speaking in the language that they speak to be critical of, seriously, what just came out of your mouth, right? In this way that, we can talk about the consequences of that politically, but what does that look like? And when you have young people being able to speak back in a way that becomes shareable and spreadable in a delightful way. So I think it does get often tapped into within a commercial or capitalist environment, but I think it's also important to acknowledge how much of this allows for an expression of activism that is extraordinarily important in a very jaded population.
So then how do you then channel it? Sam, you started out earlier talking about creating a context for learning that kind of looks like this other context where a lot of really interesting activity is going on. And it's complicated, to quote Dana again, right? There's multiple levels to this. It can go in different directions. So what are some other things that you would say are important to do or think about if we're going to try and channel this activity into and even if it already reflects critical thinking and a critical engagement, but sort of amplify it, regulate it, develop it, and into something like civic engagement more broadly. Mm-hmm.
So one of the theories that has come out of this work is this thing I keep referring to of connected learning, which is at root the belief that when young people are able to see the convergence of the learning that happens in their social, peer-supported space with the learning that happens in their interest-driven spaces that involve the things they want to get better at, and an intersection with the things that matter for them in the context of school and work, that the convergence of those social, interest, and academic sectors produces this connected learning experience. And so part of what we want to do is create more of those experiences and more of those spaces. And experiments like this are happening throughout the city. I mentioned UMedia as one such space, really. And I'd just like to reference another, which is a project called STEAM Studio that involved some of the members of the network coming together to take advantage of a space on the ground floor of the Chicago Cultural Center. If you know that building, you might know the room. It's a big rectangular room that has one wall that's completely glassed, so that anybody walking by the main hallway, and thousands of people are in this space every day, can see what's happening on the inside. Mm-hmm. And so we thought this would be a great space for learning because it is in the open, and it invites people in to see what's happening. And so we, for the second year now, created a pop-up makerspace there that was themed around fashion, and that had young people doing things like using computer-aided design to create jewelry, print them out on 3D printers, and do that in a way that people can see, and with an open house that passersby could come in the afternoon and create artifacts of their own. Mm-hmm. And so what this space enabled was creating a context for interests that kids might have, the design process in a fashion context, use a lot of the technical skills that they might have in an otherwise STEM-related context, 3D printing, vinyl cutting, graphic design, and be able to create the opportunity for them to, with very tight constraints, produce a line in a week. And one of the stories that one of the mentors in that space, Brother Mike Revolution, shares is that this is so again, this is happening in the open. Think of it as a reality TV show happening in real life. One of the young women who was in the space in the first year engaged, but never was able to really produce anything. Mm-hmm. The second year, she came back to this program and understood from her previous failure what was needed to take advantage of the challenge of producing in this constrained environment, connecting with the community of peers who are going to push her work, engaging with the mentors who could help lead her forward, and she ended up receiving an internship with Burberry as a result of this, all supported by digital badging that helped provide evidence of what she had learned. So there's a lot in that story, but the point is really convergence and connection, mm-hmm. and creating a space for that to happen.
Well, now is the time to converge with our audience and invite your participation. Right? So we have people with microphones here and here. So if you want to get your hand in the air, we'll start taking questions. And if we have any come via Twitter, Mark Larson down here will convey them. Yeah? Twitter questions, if we get any. Yeah. So, hi.
Hi. I teach a course at National Louis. It's an online course, and I love it. It's called The Culture of Chicago, which presents some problems for me in terms of teaching, in that there is a virtual space of interaction, and as you were talking about, there's a real world of the neighborhoods. And the students who might naturally do better in such a course are those who have an experience of the neighborhoods and are not just talking about it. So that's one challenge for me. The other challenge for me is that I think it's very important for students to have that space, a safe space, to share their feelings, their emotion, their story. In the course that I do, it's pretty text specific. And they have to know what the text says before they react to it with their opinion. So this is my struggle. How do we develop online learning that respects people's story, that connects to space, at least space-time world, and also can interact with objective data as well as the subjective story of students and persons?
The first answer I'd say to that is that we are in a stage of absolute experimentation. We can pretend like we know how to integrate all of these media into the classroom, and like anybody who says that they're an expert on that is kind of lying. Like, we're all in an experimental stage where there's no necessarily certain things work better than others. We know that, but it's not necessarily perfect. One of the things that I think is beautiful about these technologies is to not get enamored by the technology itself and to figure out how it works pedagogically and where it doesn't work. And you know what? There's a lot to be said about stomping the ground and walking through those neighborhoods and understanding what the physicality means. And there's a lot to be said about reading historically. But these are each different learning experiences, right? And so part of it as an educator is that it's your job, your responsibility to figure out what are the different things that people can learn through different kinds of experiences, whether those experiences are textual, whether those experiences are interactive, whether those experiences are experiential. Like, what is the combination of it that allows not just an individual learner to get the most out of their experience, but to allow the diversity of learner and their learner types figure out what the right combination is. And so what's also challenging is that what's going to work in your class is not going to work in yours, right? It's not so easily transferable. That said, there's a lot to be said about these tools, right? You can scale at a fundamentally different level. That's pretty phenomenal. You can create totally different kinds of conversation with different kinds of learners participating at different levels. That's phenomenal. But there's always going to be a matter of trade-offs. And so it's about navigating that, and then beyond that, it's, it'd be more diving into the specifics.
You killed it.
Okay. So, do you have over here? Are we? Oh.
I do have a Twitter question.
All right.
What can we learn from the recent ALS Bucket Challenge bullying incident on Twitter involving a teen with Asperger's?
That we have a very intolerant society, and we kind of... One of the things about visibility is that we think we can put people out into public and that they'll get support and love and validation, and that's not how this works. I'm going to move away from the ALS specific one and talk about another case that I've spent a lot more time on. After a whole rash of LGBT-related deaths by suicide, I was really struggling to make sense of what was going on, particularly as a queer youth growing up. We saw the internet very much as our savior. And indeed, we saw during those early years that participation in the internet and finding community and figuring out you were not alone was correlated with increased levels of survival and decreased levels of suicide attempts. And then I started to really struggle with that when I was starting to do my field work, trying to make sense of it, and it all hit a head a couple of years ago. Now, the thing that was particularly striking to me when I was trying to make sense of all of that is that it was shortly after the It Gets Better campaign. So I started diving in and trying to understand what we could understand about the It Gets Better campaign. For those who didn't remember this campaign, the idea was to make a video and say, it gets better. And it was a lot of adults, very famous queer adults sort of standing up and being like, you can get through those teen years, it gets better. And a lot of young people responded back being like, when? How is that going to work out? Right? And that created an alternate campaign called Make It Better, which was intriguing. But one of the things when I started tracking the It Gets Better campaign videos and watching the kids that were making them was I watched so many young people make those videos thinking that they would find community. They'd put these up on YouTube thinking that they would find support and love and validation and find that they were not alone. Not only did, folks not respond to them, but those who did respond were more likely to be hateful and attackful, and worse was with the responses they got from their peers at school. Right? So all of a sudden, they basically outed themselves in a highly publicly visible way, only to get attacked more at home. And in the year and a half following that campaign, when I was tracking public LGBT-related deaths by suicide by young people, I found that most of them had made videos. right? What do you do with that, right? That is just terrifying. That just breaks at your heart. And I say this because one of the things that I see about a lot of these campaigns, and the ALS Bucket Challenge was one of them, was that people feel like they're part of something. They're part of something bigger. They think that they'll be a part of a community. But we have spent so much time telling young people that talking to strangers is dangerous and telling people to not talk to people that aren't like you, that we don't prepare young people for realizing a world in which those strangers aren't going to communicate with them because they don't know how to build those relationships. And indeed, in a celebrity-style fashion, you become visible and you just become a target, right? And if anybody's followed any celebrity out there, like I love talking to teens who want to be famous. It's like, take a look at a famous person's videos of any form and just be prepared for that kind of crass harassment. It's awful, right? And so then I go back and say, what is it that we've done within our society where we've created that, right? Because we've done it. We take anybody who's a public figure and we have the right as a society to deconstruct them, to tear them apart, to discuss their bodies, right? What is that about? And so we do this, and then it gets done to young people, and it gets done repeatedly because it has become normalized. And it is particularly harrowing for those who are extraordinarily vulnerable, whether we're talking about young LGBT youth or whether we're talking about kids that are on the spectrum. And that's where I think that we actually have to stand up and figure out how to be responsible about this. The one thing I will say that's been really amazing is to watch some of the other adults and other young people who are much more supportive and piled on top of it. So for all of the horribleness and, oh God, it was horrible, there was a lot of also sort of rallying of the troops. But I would also invite all of you, take a moment and be nice to strangers online. Just go and talk to people. They're people. They're good. And so rather than tearing apart or critiquing somebody, try to provide some love online. It would do a lot of good for all of us to engage in that.
But I imagine this is where those critical skills have to come into play, because it doesn't seem like if you look at a site like Facebook, it doesn't really encourage you to talk to people who are not like you, and I don't, it encourages, in some ways, those silos. And so it's not going to be that safe space or that exploratory space where whatever you're negotiating there, it's not necessarily going to involve that negotiating with someone who is not me or not like me.
And I think that's where a certain degree of web literacy does need, as you point out, Dana, to be deliberately taught. Teaching the mechanics of the web, teaching the culture of the web, and the citizenship as well.
Hi.
Hi.
It's kind of along the same lines. So you're talking earlier about, us as adults, we have stuff that we're really glad we're not recorded for eternity. But now that children are growing up in this era where everything they do is recorded forever, how do we change our society so that we don't start bullying people, so we don't, pull up something from 30 years in the past and use it against them today when they're running for office or they're getting a job? Or how do we change society like that?
The last 3 presidents, I smoked and didn't inhale. I found God. I was young, get over it, right? That is an amazing transformation in terms of drug responses in this country in 3 presidents. Now, I point this out because those 3 individuals had a tremendous amount of privilege to be able to stand up and say, you have to shift how you are going to judge me. Now, the reason I say this is we put a lot of burden on young people and other adults to figure out every context in which they may one day eventually operate and to try to navigate their public impression accordingly. No one can do that. You can take anything out of context and manipulate what somebody said with ease. Why do we put the burden on the person who is doing the speaking, rather than the person who's doing the interpretation? So I think about this in a case very early on in my fieldwork. It was the era of MySpace. MySpace was cool. And college admissions officers were starting to go to MySpace to figure out young candidates that they were really intrigued by. And I received a phone call from an Ivy League admissions officer who had received an application from a young man from South Central in Los Angeles that had written beautifully about wanting to leave behind the gangs that he had grown up in. And they were really enamored with his essay, they were really excited about him, and then they went to his MySpace portfolio. And it was filled with gang insignia in ways that were clearly indicative of the fact that he was affiliated. And the question that they asked me is, why would he lie to us when we can tell the truth online? Now, we can see where this is going, both because I've kind of let it in there, and also because history has shaped this in different ways. But of course, I've spent a lot of time in South Central, and I know that gang affiliation is often survival for many of these young people, right? Their families are affiliated, their cousins, their neighbors, et cetera, et cetera. And so what I saw from this young person was trying to navigate two radically different contexts, right? This goes back to our conversation on contexts. And what is it about that very privileged elite institution that could make a decision that they would judge that young person on their terms rather than trying to understand him on his terms? And so one of the biggest challenges I think that we're going to all have to face with all of this, especially for those of us who care about equity, is how to learn to judge people on their terms without jumping automatically to assumptions about them. And this is going to be really tricky. This is going to be tricky for a couple of different reasons. The first of which is the fact that we are automating a lot of these processes. So, for those who haven't applied for a service labor job in recent years, one of the things you'll find is that that's an automated process where you're automatically removed based on words you might have included or not included in your application. What does it mean that that interpretation is being done programmatically rather than through humans who make decisions? That looks really discriminatory really fast. What does it mean in terms of the massive divides that we have in this country, right? This country's inequity issues are huge. What does that mean for interpretation? And so this is, for anybody who cares about issues of social justice or cares about questions about the future of fairness in our society, we really need to think about our responsibilities doing that interpretation and how we build that into our technical systems that actually make these decisions, because that's going to be what helps those young people figure out how to navigate it, not teaching them how to imagine every possible future. That's just not fair.
I'll go to another question.
I will probably date myself with this question, which should not be interpreted as approval or disapproval, but really a sincere attempt to understand. Assuming that teenagers spent the same amount of time in school and sleeping before the internet as they do now, what time or what has their time on the internet in social media replaced what they may have done before the internet? And where do you see this going 10 years from now, 20 years from now? And somewhat unrelated question, what happens when the teenager moves from the alleged safety of being in front of a screen to actually face-to-face with other people?
Sam, I feel like a lot of adults can figure out what social media has replaced or think it's replaced in their lives, right? But what do you hear from people you work with? What do you see shifting in behavior, habits, practices?
Well, one of the things that you point out, Dana, is that whereas kids might have been hanging out at the mall, they're hanging out online. And a lot of that hanging out happens not at the hanging out time when I'm at the mall with my friends and get picked up, but it's happening continuously throughout the day whenever it's possible to fit it in. I'm interested in this idea of hanging out asynchronously. When you're hanging out at the mall, like all of the conversations are happening at the same time in the same place. But social media, because there is the persistence, enables a conversation that one member of it is having at 2 a.m. to be picked up by their friend at 8 a.m. and for that conversation to be continuing in really interesting ways. So I think hanging out is one thing people are doing, but not doing necessarily in a way that replaces the time they spend elsewhere, but it infuses the time that they're spending in lots of places.
And to the point, homework is at an all-time high. People spend more hours doing homework today than they have over many decades. Young people, especially in middle upper class environments, are spending more time in structured activities than they ever have been historically, and from morning to night, often from 6 a.m. until past dark. They're in structured activities. By the way, this declines into family time in really significant ways. They are sleeping a lot less because you know what? If you come home from your last basketball game at 9:30 at night, you're not going to bed at 10 p.m. no matter what else is going on. The one thing that is declining in numbers is television. Which isn't that surprising. Of course, YouTube, television, we can have that conversation, right? So these things become part of it. But what Sam is pointing to is another critical thing. Unlike other forms of hanging out where you really just spent a lot of chunks of time with your friends, this is about fitting into the interstices. This is about that 15 minutes that you've got when you're theoretically going to the bathroom, right? And we still do it as adults, by the way, that you're like texting in the middle of something because you took a break from basketball, right? It's about that time. And so, yeah, young people, they get home, they're stressed out at the end of the day, they just want to relax and hang out. And guess what? They're talking on their devices in a whole variety of different ways, or they're playing games, or they're doing any number of things at 10 o'clock at night because it's the first time that they're able to sit and breathe. Right? And so I also get really worried about our time equations because our time equations often blame the technology for the lack of sleep or the stressed outness rather than recognizing that it's the relief valve and we have really structured their lives and they get very little downtime. And the field work that I had was so depressing on this. Like I'd talk to kids and they'd map out their schedules for me and they were exhausted just mapping them out. Right? And like, so it's, you know, we do this as adults, but let's not put this on our kids too. Thanks.
Hello. Let me see if I can ask this question simply. A lot of what we're talking about assumes like the internet is just the internet, and the internet came in and, of course, is shaping the ways that kids engage. But so much of it has to do with how the tools on the internet are designed. So you talked about MySpace. You know, kids blogged more. They knew HTML because you had to create your page. Facebook, you know, it's all needs to be the same. So, and Dana, you started off by saying something about how, you know, Facebook's the rise and fall of Facebook. So given the amount of time that you spend thinking about all this and talking to designers of these things, can you say something about how we're perceiving or thinking about the designs of these types of technologies to be able to maybe support more of the types of interactions we want to see, or how much the conversation is taking place in designers of these tools about the consequences of the social types, the collapsing of contexts, if you will, that they've enabled, and whether that's good and some people are trying to fight back against it, create new types of tools, or is it even in a conversation in the social media tech space?
Let's be completely honest, these are commercial entities. Lots of nonprofits have tried to actually build out these sites. They're an amazing organization that, you know, both of you guys have worked with in phenomenal ways, trying to reimagine these things in a non-commercial environment. Not only are these commercial, they're ad-driven. What that means for them to be ad-driven is that you need more eyeballs and more time on there to keep it going, right? And this is the commercial environment in the capitalist society that we adults created. Right? We have removed the park as a safe place for young people, so they're going to these commercial environments. I say this because the pressures of capitalism, the pressures of what venture capital look like, have made it such that these environments usually start with really good intentions, and they really do, all of them, right? Even the ones that you're most grossed out by now. They start with really good intentions of reimagining sociality, and then they get hit with the realities of commercialism and how to actually function and how to make it work in there. And they make some trade-offs, and those trade-offs can be devilish, right? And I'm not going to pick on any one company and all of that, but part of it is to understand what that looks like. It's also really tricky because we are now at a moment, I did reference Facebook sort of on the decline. We're at a fragmentation, right? And, it's Instagram and Vine, it's Snapchat, it's Tumblr, it's Twitter, it's all over the place. And it's a lot of smaller ones that I didn't even name because they're really dependent on the community and what goes on. None of those are actually really economically sustainable without figuring out how to have ad revenue, right? And we start to think about it. What are our social spaces that are really sustainable, right? And again, we're going to quickly come back to alcohol, right? Because we have, as adults, sustained most social spaces on substances, right? And our history of trying to remove substances from them did not go over well. So part of it is this becomes this really tricky thing about what is the icky trade-off that we do online. Do I want to see these things redesigned? Absolutely. But I think in order to do so, we actually have to come and grapple with these tensions of what it means to invest in things that look like they're for a public good. And I hate to say it, but in this country, we're not investing in anything that's for the public good, right? Like, let alone social media. Like, I'm not seeing any reasonable investment. And that's where it's a really tricky thing. The early stage startups, they're amazing. They really do try. They really try to make sense of it. But how do you figure out how to make it all work in this environment? And I don't know the good equation there. I really genuinely don't.
Sam?
I think the one thing I just wanted to make note of is that one of the efforts right now that you know a lot about to try to design spaces for a kind of learning or connecting what happens in the network world to learning is this work around digital badging, which deserves mention in this conversation. The Chicago City of Learning is one of a growing global network of City of Learning initiatives that are trying to use digital badges as a way to give evidence of skills gained, competencies achieved, and to use those digital badges to unlock opportunities, like the Burberry opportunity that I mentioned earlier. And this is something that I'm just noting because it's happening in a combination of spaces. It's happening in nonprofit spaces. It's happening among collaborations of museums, like the CSTEM-B work in the Hive, and it's happening by for-profit companies who are trying to figure out how you seize upon the opportunity to use digital media to help young people accumulate a portfolio as evidence of learning, and there's great promise in that, and there are also risks, as with all technology, as well.
Or yeah, that it looks a lot like sort of the points you can earn in a different context, right? So that you'll get a discount on a meal, or there's a lot of that's become like checking in a place, Foursquare or something like that, where you have that same kind of like point system happening. So how do you differentiate it from that so that it looks like something that is not just about commodities or...
And how does it fundamentally connect to things that the young people care about getting better at, as opposed to being an extrinsic motivator.
Rewarding for different kind of behavior, yeah.
I do want to point out that young people actually get how commercial things are, and they mess with it, right? Like, I'll never forget I was sitting in a school, I was watching a boy message his friend through Gmail. He was sending emails back and forth. It was one of the few things that was not blocked in school. And I watched him write this sort of email, which is always really funny when you watch teenagers actually write email, because that's not their thing. And then he wrote this email, and then he scrolled down, way down, and he wrote all this other text, and then he highlighted it and turned it white, so it was white on white. And I'm like, what are you doing? And he's like sending a message back and forth and then I realized that the text in all of it was really about babies and about like toddler things and all of this. And I'm like, what are you doing? And then I realized that nothing is funnier if you're 15 than getting your friends to get diapers ads, right? Like, that's just awesome, right? And I'd watch teenagers like sit there, just like, great, that's awesome. And then I watched teenagers sitting there, and they realized that Facebook was manipulating their algorithms, so they were not seeing everything that was flowing down the feed. But they realized that things that had references to brands or to BuzzFeed articles, they went to the top. So you see these great posts like, yo, what's up, Nike? Okay, right? Or like random BuzzFeed articles plugged into like conversations back and forth. And I say this because, even as young people are living with these commercial environments as part of their world around them, they are messing with it, they are challenging it. And that's a reminder that these systems are not just designed in a one-way path. They're co-constructed, and that co-construction is extraordinarily valuable. And some of the most creative stuff I've seen online is kids really challenging that commercial environment. Right? Chevy decided that they were going to run a campaign of making the best YouTube video ever, right? For one of their highly commercial environments. This never goes over well, by the way. Any marketers in the room, it never goes over well. And of course, since it's, we're talking about climate change this week, needless to say, most of the videos were about all of these, gas guzzling, monoliths. And to Chevy's credit, they didn't try to take them down, right? It became a conversation piece. I just say that because even as young people are, living in this, it's not that they're doing so necessarily uncritically. And part of it is to sort of encourage that along, to help them question what's around them, and just also realize that we can't expect them to escape commercial environments because it's their only access point to sociality.
I think we have time for one more question.
All right.
How does the internet change how we understand each other?
Thank you for that. We live in a very, very connected world. And part of it is to appreciate that we are connected to people at much greater distances than we even understand. You're growing up in an environment where you get to see the networks around you. And this is actually a radically different way of thinking. Historically, we thought in terms of groups. We were part of clans. We were part of a particular geographically bounded environment. We were part of the basketball team. Whatever version of this, these were understood to be bounded environments. The internet is allowing us to actually see that we are part of a very networked environment. And one of the big challenges for your generation is to figure out how to see that and not just be afraid of the people that are 2 or 3 hops, but to appreciate them and realize that we have so much more in common than we ever did because we can actually see the networks around us, because we are living as part of the network. But it's one of the big challenges because the immediate response, I hate to say it, is that people get afraid of the other. They're afraid of the things that are out there. And this is one of the reasons why it becomes this challenge of letting this as an opportunity to see in a productive way, not see in a fearful way.
I think that I'm not sure what has happened, but I think what has the potential to happen is that because of the connection that's enabled by the internet, we have the ability to solve some big problems that none of us can solve on our own. And I think that's the real potential that we're trying to unlock in a network context and in a learning context.
Hopefully we can do it. You gonna help us?
Join the
Another
hive.
one.
Well, thanks for your question. Thanks to everybody for your questions here and via Twitter.